is now my pleasure to get tonight's event started by introducing our first reader, nonfiction writer Amy Sullivan. Raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Amy has lived in the Twin Cities for the past 4 years. She is an historian, a feminist educator who has studied women's history, children's history, and the history of medicine. Having been primarily an academic writer, Amy applied to the Mentor Series with the hope of learning how to better incorporate memoir into history. In a conversation with MaryAnn posted this week on the Loft's writer's block, Amy said she wanted to free up some of the creative vitality that had been drained during her academic training. It will do that to you, yes, and to start taking herself seriously as a writer. Though Amy has presented papers at many history conferences, tonight it is my pleasure to say, please welcome the writer, Amy Sullivan.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm just so honored to be here. This has just been an amazing 6 months, and I really am excited for the next 6 months. After that, I don't want to think about it. This is a short excerpt from a memoir, or a memory chapter is what I'm calling it, and it's still up for discussion with my dissertation committee whether this will be in my actual dissertation or not, but I'm stretching myself here by reading this to you. It's an excerpt from a larger oral history project about the tragedy of 3 Girl Scouts being murdered in Oklahoma in 1977. Memory. Junior Girl Scout, Troop 277, Magic Empire Council of Girl Scouts. Diary excerpt from June 12th, 1977. Well, here I am writing in my diary while it's raining. Kim's telling a story now. It's still raining. These girls are making noise for about 2 hours now. I can't get to sleep, so I'm writing. It's about the only thing to do when you can't go to sleep. Kim and I became best friends when we were in the same 4th grade class and Girl Scout troop at Lee Elementary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Incredibly, to us anyway, we were both left-handed, shared the same April Fool's Day birthday, loved drawing mice, and collected miniatures. To our amazement, we discovered that we both had 3-letter first names and 8-letter last names. What were the chances? These blood sister commonalities cemented our friendship with a 9-year-old sense of the predestined, never to be forsworn. Kim's house was where I had my first sleepover. As the oldest of 3 girls, I had no reference point for brothers, but Kim was in the middle of 2 boys. Her big brother, Mark, was especially strange and mysterious to me, with his tight bell-bottoms, feathered hair, and stinky sweet chewing tobacco. Her parents, Kay and Dan, sold Amway products, something that also intrigued and confused me. Most of all, Kim enchanted me with her black hair and her graceful, curvy body. Gangly and blonde, I remember wondering exactly how long I'd have to wait for such a body. Early in 1977, we planned to go to Girl Scout summer camp near Tulsa and signed up for the very first session. We made required camp accessories together, a sit-upon and a dip bag, for those of you in the know, both in 1970s sherbet floral oranges and plaid greens. June 12th finally arrived. We sat together on the big charter bus and decided that if we were given a choice, we definitely wanted to sleep in the same tent. Everyone was so excited, and girls sang silly camp songs all the way to Locust Grove. You know, like, just a boy and a girl in a little canoe. When we arrived at camp and disembarked into groups, our wish to be tent mates came true. We unpacked our gear and settled into our new camp home. That night, at what everyone called the Great Hall, we had a dinner at long tables and learned many rules about camp dining room etiquette. I was very nervous. The food tasted strangely bland. After dinner, a few counselors led us in songs as we huddled under a covered patio connected to Great Hall, a spot affectionately known as the Singing Porch. Oklahoma is known for dramatic weather changes, and this June night did not disappoint. The onset of an extremely heavy thunder and lightning storm kept us singing on the porch for a time. When the storm let up enough for us to get on with the evening, we headed back, the trees still dripping, and raced back to our tents. We spent the rest of the evening talking and messing around with our new camp stuff. I wrote in my journal. When I finally turned my flashlight off, the darkness was so deep I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or shut. That darkness became my personal measure of any darkness from that night forward. I fell asleep to waves of giggling and laughing, yelling and screaming late into the night. Drifting off, I heard counselors chiding girls to be quiet. The next morning when we heard the camp bell, we knew from the previous night's instruction we were to get dressed and ready for breakfast. Our unit walked to the Great Hall along a paved road this time, not the previous night's wooded trail. As we were walking in a line at the edge of the road, 3 ambulances drove slowly past us. Remarkably, I thought nothing of it, and no one else commented either. After breakfast, our counselors told us that we were going on a creek hike to swim and picnic. Before we left, though, they said we had to pack our belongings and put them in a pile in our unit. I remember a huge chalk circle was drawn in the ground where we were to put our camp gear. Besides the disorienting task of having to pack, the pile of gear with a circle around it disturbed me. Nevertheless, I was new to camp, moved along with everyone else, and like a good Girl Scout, did exactly as directed. The creek hike was an adventure at first. We tromped along a path and came upon a swimming hole with a thin sandy beach and a striking rock overhang on the other side of the creek. Not fond of swimming, I hung near the shore. I noticed that a few counselors were sitting together close to the tree line behind me. If a swimming or meandering girl strayed a little towards the edge of where we first landed, one of the counselors would holler at her to stay close by. They definitely seemed different that morning, quieter, distracted, not quite so carefree. Gave me a strange feeling. At one point, a grown-up came down to where we were, called a girl's name, and took her back down the trail. Where was she going? I don't remember how much time we spent at the creek, but when we returned, the big buses were back. What? We had to go home? Why? What happened? No one said. Some of the older girls on the bus were really mad. They wanted to know the reason. I heard someone say something about a water shortage. I guess that made sense. We all needed water, but why didn't the grown-ups know that before now? I was my usual self, quiet and observant. Kim and I again shared a seat for the ride back home. Some girls made lanyards, and others looked at magazines. No one sang. Finally, we arrived in Tulsa at the same parking lot where we had departed just the day before, but the scene was incredibly different. I perked up my head, immediately alert. The parking lot teemed with dozens of parents, reporters, television cameras, photographers, cars, and news vans. What was the big deal? What was going on? We descended from the bus into a sea of grown-ups who looked stressed and anxious to find their daughters. I wondered the whole way home what I would do when we got to Tulsa because my family had gone to Dallas the day before. My dad to a teacher's conference, and my mom and sisters to visit her parents, my Nana and Grandpa. Kim and I decided to talk to her mom to see if I could stay with her until they returned in a day or two. I hung close to Kim during all the confusion. We finally found her mom. She said my grandma was looking for me. Grandma? What's she doing here? I still didn't know what was happening. Sometime shortly after finding Kim's mom, my grandma appeared in the crowd. She looked distraught. We got my gear and went directly to her giant olive green Chevy Impala. A few minutes later at a stoplight, I remember looking at her very closely. I asked her what happened. Oh, honey. Now she was crying, looking straight ahead. 3 girls were killed at your camp last night. Killed? The tears on her cheeks stayed there while she accelerated through the green light. I could not understand how that could be. Killed at camp while I slept? When we arrived at her house, Grandma made me SpaghettiOs. I loved them. A treat at her house always, yet I wasn't hungry. I just stirred them around in the little white bowl. Then we called my mom and dad. They seemed upset and happy at the same time. After we hung up, Grandma called an airline company and arranged for me to fly by myself to Dallas. I remember their reasoning. It was the quickest way I could get to them. I had never flown, much less alone. Not long after, Grandma and I were in the Tulsa airport. We walked past one of the newspaper dispensers. In huge letters across the top of the paper, the headline read, 3 girls slain. How could it already be in the news? I was just there. I didn't even understand what happened yet, and there it was, a headline in the newspaper dispenser at the airport. Things happened so fast. I couldn't keep up, and I didn't understand. I had all these thoughts as we hurried towards the gate. I knew even then that this was much bigger than anything I could comprehend, like the size of the universe, terribly, disturbingly big like that. I sat alone in my own row near the front. The stewardess gave me a 7-Up, but before I'd even finished drinking it, we had landed in Dallas-Fort Worth. My family was at the gate. My mom was crying. My sisters would not stop staring at me. Even after we got in our van, I asked Mom to make them stop. She explained they had been scared and were happy to see me. That was the first moment I remember feeling strangely exposed. Why were they scared? It seemed that everyone else was feeling something or seeing something that I wasn't. I felt numb, unsettled, and hollow. Later that evening at my Nana's apartment, I asked if I could call Kim to see if she was okay. Of course, Amy dear, she lilted in her Boston brogue. Kim and I talked for just a moment. I was starting to feel upset by then, afraid, but not sure of what exactly, and really wanted to know if she felt the same. She sounded cool and distant. Are you okay? I asked her. Are you scared? No, I'm fine, she said. It didn't seem like her. When we hung up, I felt a discomforting distance between us. It was the first time I'd ever felt this space, this gap, that somehow separated me from someone I loved. How could we have both been there when 3 girls our age were raped and murdered, and she was fine and I was frightened? What did that mean? And what was rape exactly? I could not make any sense of the information I had, or for that matter, the event itself. Later that night, in my grandparents' giant bed, I fell asleep in my mother's arms, and I sobbed and sobbed, crying for the first time during a long, unsettling day. My journal entries 3 weeks later revealed a child trying to integrate something very troubling into the otherwise little events of a typical 10-year-old life. In my fanciest, most loopy cursive, I wrote, July 6th, 1977. Maggie is 4 now. I don't really know what fear is, and because of all the happenings, like the 3 girls, GSs, murdered, and a girl kidnapped. Linda's hamster died last night. And all of these have made me begin to feel what fear is like. Goodbye. By the winter and spring of 1978, anxiety and fear dominated my life. I only slept when all of my stuffed animals had been arranged around my body, neck to toes, and only after my parents had come in to kiss me. Mom had to be first, always, and then Dad. The order was very important, and I hated it when they messed up. My door had to be open about a foot exactly, with the stove light on in the kitchen. Despite these precise rituals, I knew eventually the killer was going to find me. Indeed, he would often appear in my room behind the space of the door just before I slept. Once the actual suspect had been caught and I knew he was in prison, this imposter morphed into other scary men acting on his behalf. Which scary man made no difference, because whoever he was or they were, the evil work of killing Girl Scouts, girls, my sisters, and my mother never ceased playing out in my mind. Every time my mom or sisters were out alone and didn't come back at what I thought was the appointed time, I would sit on the porch and wait, and often I would cry. In the case of my youngest sister, Maggie, I would go looking for her if she didn't come home from school when I thought she should be. My thinking then was that if at any time I was feeling safe, then others I loved were probably in danger, and therefore they would be targeted for assault instead of me. It made perfect sense in my newly imperfect world. My parents accommodated my anxiety for as long as they could, and when it didn't subside, they looked to help from a psychologist friend of theirs. He interviewed and tested me. I remember being asked to draw a house, and I carefully created an elaborate drawing of a hill with an arched wooden door in it, a kind of hobbit house or something, a little clothed woodland animal, from a Beatrix Potter book would happily inhabit. When I was then referred to a psychiatrist and told by my parents I had to start visiting this odd-sounding name for a doctor, I remember thinking that something must have been very wrong with the house I drew. Did that drawing somehow reveal that something in me needed to be fixed? No more hobbit houses. Sometime later, I met Dr. Betsy Wallach. She had a platinum bob, glasses, and sat behind a desk when she talked to me. I felt very small in the stuffed leather chair across from her. She may have been kind. I know she wasn't mean, but she soon became my emotional enemy. It seemed to me that her only interest was to deliberately make me cry every single time I saw her. I dreaded these visits more than having cavities filled. One day on the ride after school to see her, I asked my dad how long I had to keep going. "When you feel better, honey, when you don't have any more fears." Miraculously? You got it. My fears were gone within like 2 visits. I somehow convinced my parents that I was better, really, because I hated going, hated feeling exposed, and figured out I could simply hide my fears. I succeeded at this strategy for quite some time. I thought I might find some true relief when Jean Leroy Hart was finally captured in April of 1978. I watched the news as obsessively as someone who's 11 and had only 4 channels to choose from could. I read the paper every day. I know my parents struggled with this. I could see my mom watching me from across the room when I was reading an article related to the murders, which for the 9 months since was nearly every day. My first act as an informed citizen came when I wrote a letter to a beloved local news anchor, Clayton Vaughn, regarding what should happen to Jean Leroy Hart now that he'd been captured. He read letters on air every night, and I waited for days to see if he'd read mine. I didn't have to wait long. He read it with such seriousness, and I saw that he didn't just think of me as a little girl. I was a Girl Scout. I was at Camp Scott that very night. And in my letter, I wholeheartedly advocated for Hart to get the death penalty. This was the first, last, and only time that I've advocated for the death penalty. But at that moment, I just wanted my fears to stop.